We have extremely interesting guests, our artists, and Marcus Collier and Noeleen Smyth as well, from the Trinity College and University Dublin. College Dublin. I'm always confused between these acronyms. And the talk is about the ecologies in Dublin and the incredible work that is quite unknown for most of us. And I would like to pass the word to give us a context to Marcus.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that good? My name is Marcus Collier. I'm Associate Professor of Sustainability Science in Trinity College. I'm in the School of Natural Sciences and in the discipline of botany. And my research for quite a lot, actually for almost all my academic life, has been the interface between society and ecology, the interface between our human agency and natural ecosystems. And the work I'm currently doing, I won't go into all details, is running a particular project called Novel Eco, which is about novel ecosystems or urban wild spaces or abandoned or emerging ecosystems in cities, but what people perceive of them and how they feel with them, and reconnecting people with nature. So that's generally what I'm doing. So I won't go into great detail about that. We have a website, noveleco, all one word, .ie, and you can find that. Just Google it, and you can see the information in better detail. But what I was asked to talk about, if I remember rightly, is just talking about novel ecologies, this idea of different ecologies. This is probably going to be hard to hear, but you probably already know this. There are no pristine ecosystems left on this planet. There's nowhere on this planet in our ecosystems where you cannot find something of human progress, whether it is microplastics at the bottom of the Marianas Trench or nuclear residue from the 1950s and 60s testing in the soils of the Amazon. Somewhere you'll find something that is of a human nature. And then in lots of other places, there's deliberate changes of the ecosystems. And around 40% of the global ecosystems are deemed to be anthropogenic. They've been created deliberately by people. This is part of like farmland and other things like that. So the concept in ecology, in coming from the restoration part for people who are trying to restore ecosystems, people started talking about how ecosystems perhaps are. We should maybe let some of these do their own thing because we cannot restore them. They're in the cities, they're in places where we can never get back to an ecosystem of the past. And it's a bit of a controversial thing because it's deemed to be that if you do some damage deliberately, you can use the phrase, well, when we're finished with all our work here, it'll become a novel ecosystem. It sounds new, it sounds fresh, it sounds ideal. But all it means is just it's a human or a created ecosystem. And with that, I mean that you've got your combination of plants and animals that were local to the area, that were from the past, but also newly arrived ones, garden escapes, escaped crops, deliberately planted things, and that sort of thing, invasive species, non-invasive species, and so on. So the reason why it's interesting for me, and I'm looking at some of the pieces here that I can see in my eye. I can see like there's humanity as well as ecology in the images. Why it's interesting to me is that perhaps we have a history, a social history that goes back probably hundreds of thousands of years of a removal from nature, seeing ourselves separate to nature. And we deem that most of our problems in relation to climate change and biodiversity loss is the fact that we don't see ourselves anymore as part of nature. We've lost the connectivity. So perhaps the question we could ask is these weird and wonderful places at the corner of the road and the side of the park and abandoned places, perhaps these are locations which could help to bring people closer back to a wild sort of nature instead of having to pay fortune to go to Yellowstone National Park and places like that, which, as I've just said earlier, isn't actually an ecosystem of the past. It has been changed by people over centuries. So that's what novel ecologies tends to be, that not only is it about this, well, I'm not trying to cast a value statement here that they're not, that I don't think they're good or bad necessarily, but I do think that there's an opportunity that they could be used to, or they could be opportunities to bring people closer to nature. And that's why we got talking about in the NCAD, the project of art and ecology, that idea of perhaps this is an opportunity to bring people closer to nature and actually see things that we wouldn't normally see on a daily basis. So that's basically what novel ecologies are, and it has a huge opportunity for other types of relationships with nature to be developed.
What is one of the topic brought up from this exhibition is what's native, what's not native. Would you like to?
Okay. So this is going to get me onto my hobby horse here. We should not be using this phrase, native or not native. That's first of all, native and not native has a very, very gruesome past. It was derived in 1930s Germany, specifically to do with plants that were from the past or originally from the area versus ones that were, let's just say, using the current rhetoric in places like North America, immigrant plants. And so it's a value statement. It isn't really necessary to use this, because ecologists we know a lot, but what we don't know would fill a lot more books than what we do know. And we can say certain plants or animals were from this part of the world, but they're not. I mean, hedgehogs were introduced into Ireland. Everybody thinks they're a native plant. They went extinct and were brought back. There's a lot of examples of what we think and we perceive is something that's been there forever, but in fact that can be quite recent. Some of them we don't pay any attention to. I don't think there's a big campaign to remove dandelions from the Irish. They're brought in by the Normans as a food plant, along with the rabbits they also brought in, which we don't see a lot of discussion about. So I try not to use the word native and non-native, because it's very much a value statement, and also it follows a geopolitical border, which is a randomly assigned line somewhere that nature does not follow. So to say something is indigenous to an area or non-indigenous area, yes, I think you know what we're trying to say here, but in fact, in reality, the real part of it is it's not necessarily quite true. Sorry.
Fantastic. You mentioned the field and let's call it experiment, or like attempt to have a wild space that people can experience. Karen, your work is connected to that space.
Hi, yes. So the field, for anyone that doesn't know it, is adjacent to NCAD, and it sort of was a disused, almost kind of brownfield site, and it has become a slightly feral ecology. I don't know if novel ecology or feral ecology or both. And it's quite an interesting site because it was a car park, and one man's radical act over many, many years of bringing horse manure and things from the vegetable market and everything built up these layers of sort of composting earth, which also sprouted forth all these, we have feral kale and all of these vegetables that came from this, which are now generationally some kind of hybrid kale monster. And it's just this wonderful sort of overgrown space of kind of randomness. And NCAD has started to interact with it, which is kind of creating this system of learning how to interact with these spaces as sort of spaces for noticing, and spaces where those ecologies can be protected, but that also what are the ways that we should or shouldn't manage it in order to have greater entanglements and experiences within it that connect us further to it. So it's a really kind of interesting kind of state of play where people are learning how to, rather than look at the plants and look at the ecology, to think with it and to be within it and to sit within it and have kind of a situated practice within that, which is really interesting, because then you sort of can see the multiplicity and the porosity of a feral landscape rather than a surface or something that we're disconnected from. So I think that's something that's really interesting to me when I try to approach how to work within these spaces, that I work with plant-based photography. So I take plants and use them as developers in my photographic practice. But that sort of has made me realize through doing it that the quirks that gives me are sort of like a multi-species collaboration, that I'm not really in control of the story anymore. It allows me to have lots of different voices that come in and help to tell the story of these plants within the ecosystem, which I think is a really interesting kind of shift in how you perceive an artist's practice. But these kind of, I think like noticing that kind of like cacophonous multiplicity in these spaces is something that kind of changes how you look at these spaces also, because these spaces are everywhere in the city. Like I live in an industrial lane that is largely ignored and full of pallets that are thrown aside and everything. And people don't think about the space at all. But actually, if you kind of sit there and like really look at it or put on headphones and listen to the space, you start to hear these hundreds and thousands of different noises of between birds and the human noises and then the industrial noises and everything that's happening. And the more you sort of sit with instead of kind of running around in it, the more expansive it all grows. And these spaces have so much interest in them. And I think that kind of like being able to notice that multiplicity and letting those things tell their stories is something that connects us to it in a way that perhaps in the past people connected, because I think something that gave people great stewardship over these spaces in the past was stories and mystery and folklore that we've sort of lost. So when I kind of get my camera and have these kind of conversations with these kind of multi-species beings and let them talk, they kind of show me all these mysterious things and stories. If you can have a look at these later, but all these sort of ghosts appear in the images that weren't there. So all these kind of mysteries and stories appear. And as you do that, these kind of plants gain an agency and an otherness that's relatable, because it's the same kind of thing as us. We have agency, we have relationality, and we kind of all get to kind of become this like becoming with together rather than just like these entities. Have I wandered off too much on that? I think using a camera as well has been kind of transformational, because initially I was quite concerned about the geology of media and the harmfulness of photographic practice and what the purpose of media was and whether it's a suitable means of documentation, because it's good to show spaces like this, but a camera is something that, you know, holds mind extractivist particles, and the film is gelatins and silvers which are mined and all of this, and the chemicals are horrific toxic chemicals that go back into the so like also thinking what is a camera and what is its purpose has been really interesting for me within this, and kind of going, well, how do you adjust your point of thinking of what a camera does and what it is, and having these like quirks that come from using plant-based developers that kind of change what a photographic image should look like. Like a lot of the ones that would be theoretically photographically wrong are much more interesting to me. So that it kind of made me go, well, the camera, I suppose, I have to sit with the trouble of it. It is a machine that contains deep time that has been mined and extracted for years and years. So, you know, how do we generate some joy from this? How do we generate something from it that tells stories in a different way and changes what a photograph is within this context?
Fantastic. You mentioned stories, personal stories, folklores, but stories coming from other places and there. Esti, you actually brought stories and from far away here.
Yeah.
Tell us.
Hi everybody. So yes, just linking with the stories and the feel. When we were there, for me, one of the things that they make us be was present on the space, and a bit what it was mentioned, to connect with it by listening, smelling, touching the plants, being present there. And we had to as well, in one of the things that crossed my mind, it was about Natasha Myers as well, talking about the vegetalization exploration of the sensoriums, learning from our senses as well. So that kind of brought me thinking, and I just as well went to, when it was my first time that I spent on a field, my first contact with nature, just going back there, and I just remembered that 25 years ago I planted flax seeds in Spain. I'm from very close to San Sebastian in the north of Spain, in the Basque Country. And I planted with my granny. She had a small plot there, and we look after it, we grow it, we cut it, and I left it dry in her attic for 25 years because I moved here. Yeah. So I remember from time to time I used to go back there, obviously visiting, and she's from occasionally it's like, Esther, do you remember you have the flaxes, the linen there? And it's like, I know, I don't know what to do with it. So then in this moment when I'm thinking what to do here, then I said, I think I want to honor that. I think maybe I want to use that flaxseed that I had there. And from then kind of developing it. So the piece that I made is with that flaxseed. I didn't want it to turn it into linen, even if, there is a history as well about flaxseed turning into the linen for clothing. I just wanted to honor the plant as it was, because it's been there for so many years. And then what to do then? I wanted to, again, connect it that from my past and my personal story with the present here in Dublin, being in the NCAD field, and I wanted as well to grow then. I started growing as well a linen here, the flax plant. I shared some seeds as well with the group, with my friends in the course, and then whoever wanted to grow, they were welcome to plant and grow, and then I planted some seeds in the NCAD and in a small plot as well at my home in Dublin. So it was on that side of looking after the seeds, and it had its challenges as well. NCAD, we don't have access to the field on our own. We need to be 2 people at least, and with permissions as well from the lecturer. So it was as well a great journey for me of that caring with the challenges of looking after the seeds, making sure that other animals as well were, again, living with the ecosystem of other animals there to make sure that it was growing. So it was that part then of the caring of the plant, and then what to do as well with it. So I wanted to do a piece where I could bring all my colleagues with me. I wanted to bring the linen history. So I came into a kind of more a collaborative performance with the group. And for that learning as well, I spoke to people in Dublin 8 with the Liberty Weavers. I spoke to Maya, very generous people as well, a bit to learn about the history of the linen here in the area. And as well, I knew a bit about the growing the linen or making the linen and the flax in the Basque Country. So it was a kind of learning processes where, again, linked to women weaving most of the times, spending lots of labor and hours working and care to make the clothing for the family. So it was kind of all those connections in my head, and bringing those stories then in a piece where I could kind of work with the threads of the linen and the group in a piece where kind of could bring all that kind of learning together. If that kind of, just to summarize a bit of the project here.
Yes. Thank you. Talking about this is your history and your interaction. Mm-hmm. Melissa actually brought us a very much Dublin history.
So I work in the Botanic Gardens, and the gardens they're over 200 years old. At the moment, there's several glass houses that are open to the public and functioning as houses, but there is one complex of houses which contains the water house, which actually has multiple different names, as we've discovered over the last while. So it's a 3-house complex. 2 of the houses are Victorian and 1 is kind of 1970s. For the last 20 years, the house complex, the 3 houses, have been boarded up. The plants would have been removed when the glass in the roof, there was issues with the structure in the glass back in 2004. So the house was closed up and the plants would have been removed eventually, bit by bit, over the kind of following period. So essentially over the last 20 years, there has been, a novel feral ecology has grown within that complex. And it's actually boarded up, so you can't even see it. So as you know, if you're in the gardens and you walk past, you see the hoardings, but you can't see the houses. So I was kind of quite fascinated by it, and coming from the field and looking at the species that were there. I had been in a few years ago to see it, but I've been extremely lucky to have access to it and to spend time in that space. So it's very strange to, you know, you go through the doorway, the locked gate, you go through, and this whole kind of almost magical kind of liminal space is there, which is full of life that we just don't see, we don't really notice unless you spend time there. So I started kind of trying to think about that, to document it, thinking about the kind of anthropogenic impact. Like it's the panoramic prints that are on the wall there. They are the kind of, I suppose, structures of this glasshouse complex. They are the physical human-made creations. And then the plants, the more than human creatures that are there, there's foxes coming in and out, there's frogs, there's, like the biome of the soil has all of these tiny little microscopic creatures in it as well. So this whole entire world is doing its thing in there, which has been hugely impacted by humans. And all of these creatures and plants, some of them remain from the plant lists that I've been able to access from the houses from 2002, 2003, 2004. So they've remained somehow or other, even though they were taken out. Others have come through lots of different means. So it could be through, people visiting, the seeds would have come in on their shoes. They might have blown in, like all the different methods of that plants will use to move as they do. So the idea, I suppose, was really to start to try and kind of document that, to show it, because it has a finite lifespan. The planning permission has gone up for the restoration of the houses. So 2 of the houses are going to be restored and 1 will be replaced. So the whole thing about time very much comes into it then. So I had started to make little pinhole cameras from drinks cans that my colleagues had used, and put them up in the house. So thinking about photography, thinking about materials, thinking about time, how to document the space over time. So these little pinholes, I did 4-month and 6-month exposures, and they're on the screen at the back. And in the images, if you can see the lines, that's actually one there. See the lines? Each one of those lines is a day. So that is the track of the sun across the sky. So these images using materials, and like you can again kind of look to the history of photography and how the materials are collected, how they're mined, and the impacts on the environment and the kind of landscapes that were first recorded as well. They're kind of quite interesting in that respect. So there are pinhole cameras that I have in there at the moment that are going to stay until I have to leave. So hopefully they will record the time, the space, the environment over that period. And like some of them have gotten damaged. The last one that's on the screen, there's all these kind of, like, I don't know what you would call it, liquidy marks all the way down it. And that was because the environment that it's in for that period of time, it's becoming part of it, it's being impacted by it. So that was kind of my starting point with the work. And then I started to make anthotypes, which take, again, a very long period of time to make. And I like to, I suppose, do things quite fast. So I find that quite a challenge to try and think in a different way about time as well. The last anthotypes that I made took 4 weeks to expose, which was super fast, particularly for winter time. So the material that the anthotypes are made from are from the plants from the houses. So I was being very careful about being in the environment and what I was collecting to make the emulsion for the anthotypes, what time of year it was. If it's something like nettle, I don't really want to collect when there's like little larvae from the peacock butterflies that live in the house there. So, thinking about the connections between all of these kind of more than human creatures that live in the house, that it's their environment that I'm kind of coming into as well. So there's I suppose lots of connections between all of the work as well. Did I answer that fully or enough?
That's fantastic. You were documenting the botanical gardens and their new life, while Dervla was documenting the life of one specific tree.
So I have always been really interested in urban ecologies because I grew up in a city and I've lived in different cities. And I suppose that while they were all different places, but cities have these same challenges really around access to green space, because usually it's limited, it's often unfairly shared. And so I suppose getting to all work together in the field was an amazing opportunity. And I had done my bachelor's in NCAD, so it was very nice to be back there in this space that, wasn't, I don't even remember it being used as a car park when I studied there. So yeah, it was amazing. And especially in Dublin 8, which has very limited green space, like maybe the most limited in Dublin, I think, in Dublin City. So and I suppose I lived in New York for a long time, and New York has really big challenges with access to green space. And I feel like I lived there for 11 years, and a lot of my choices of where to live was all about access to green space, because there's a lot of parts of New York, some really, fancy parts that have very little green space. So, yeah, so anyway, so I have a long background as a designer, and that's what I did my bachelor's in. And I suppose design I always see as very powerful, because the framework of design and design thinking and design approaches is that you're taking very complex information and breaking it down and making it accessible and simple and easy to understand. The project that is in this show is one that I did for Earth Rising in IMA in September, just past. And I wanted to choose a site in the grounds to work with. And far out in the meadow in IMA, there's a group of 3 horse chestnut trees that would have all been planted at the same time, around 85 years ago or something like that. And there, because each tree develops differently, so some of that is to do with pruning and management, but also they're all individual, so they develop in different ways. So one of the 3 has grown right down to the ground. So it's kind of created this sort of natural cave-like space inside. And when it is full in summertime and early autumn, you can't see under it at all. So it's this kind of private space, and then it also creates this sort of natural audio environment. And my partner, Jamie, is a musician and has worked with sound and music for a long time, and we both are very interested in that. So we've started to kind of work together in an expanded creative practice that's kind of taking our past sort of learning and training and then moving it in this different direction around sustainability and climate, but specifically to do with urban sites. So this tree, and I suppose this is where aesthetics comes into it a little bit, because we do, as humans, are so drawn to certain things over others, and we're kind of rating things on an aesthetic scale without even noticing. So of these 3 trees, this one, because of the way it's developed, is kind of draws you to it. So it was basically a creative research project. So for 6 weeks, we visited this tree, starting from knowing like nothing about it except just, oh, that's a very nice tree, and sort of, checking it out and going underneath. And so then it's like, okay, so we just kept visiting to learn about it. And it's a little bit, it's like this whole thing that all of the others have been talking about, kind of learning to slow down and really look and let kind of information come in. And to do that, you have to be kind of become one with the environment and all of the beings and the environment, the ambience, everything. And that is so, because we are living these very frenetic lives, that actually it takes time to do. So it was an amazing privilege and experience to be able to do that. And over the 6 weeks, we learned a lot about this tree, because it's kind of like a generative process. So the more that you learn, then that sends you down all these different rabbit holes. And what we discovered is that a lot of different multi-species beings were all drawn to this tree and visiting the tree or living in the tree. And the grounds at Imma are open as a park, and it's also, you can have dogs off leash. So there was all these different communities of human and non-human beings who are interacting with the tree. So then we also took field recordings of the sort of ambient sound world of this tree, and it does have these like special acoustic qualities because of the way that it's grown, including like living species and birds that are around the tree and in the tree, and then of course urban sounds as well, because even though it is this very nice oasis in that part of Dublin 8, but it still is a very urban area just outside the walls. So we learned a lot about different, like the tree. It's a white blossomed horse chestnut tree, and it has a lot of the white blossomed chestnut trees in Ireland have this little larva that lives in them. They're called the leaf miners, and they're like these very tiny little moths. And since the 80s, they've been kind of spreading all around, traveling very rapidly. And that is a little bit also to do with, plants being imported and people traveling more. And then all of these creatures are on the move. And so this leaf miner was first identified in Ireland only in 2013, and now it is in a lot of, and they particularly like the white blossomed horse chestnut trees, and now they're in a lot of them. And so this, from sitting with the tree, looking at the tree, sort of listening with it and observing, then you could see these little, it basically scars the leaves, and it's called the leaf miner because it burrows in the epidermis of the leaf, and slowly then it starts to shrivel and go brown, and it starts at the bottom of the tree and works its way up. And mostly it's an aesthetic thing, and the best way to manage it is when the leaves drop to clear them and not actually let them go back down into the soil, because they have the miners in them, and one single horse chestnut tree can have 1 million leaf miners in it, so that's a lot of little larvae. And then also, kind of one of the things that we found out is that one of the biggest threats to horse chestnut trees is this little bacterium called the bleeding canker of the horse chestnut tree. So it's a bacterium that's specific to the tree, and when there's a break in the bark, which in the case of this tree, there's some scarring where people have kind of carved into the bark, and that has allowed this bacterium to get in, and it also, for climate-related reasons, is becoming more difficult to manage because the winters are warmer, and so it would have died off, and now it isn't. So this tree has some of that, but not too bad, thankfully, because that can actually be very threatening to the tree. And so, it was kind of, the management of these trees is also really interesting. So the project is called Tree 68 because all of the trees have little number tags on them, because, they're all surveyed and managed, and so they have to be identified. And these little silver tags, it turned out that squirrels really like them and take them away, and nobody knows exactly why that is, but they like shiny things, and they'll bring them off, like maybe to their net. There's all different theories about why they want them, but they like them. So they had to change the numbering system. So actually now it has a different number, but it still has the little tag on there because the squirrels have not taken that one yet, but they were taking the others. So yeah, so I suppose it's we're just kind of interested in collaborative research. So we started from nothing. By the end of the 6 weeks, we knew like a lot about this tree and we're very attached to it. And then, we can connect with other people and we can take it on.
Brilliant. We were talking about aesthetics and the little miners. What about like this diversity and idea of aesthetic and the diversity of any of the known humans? Would you like to tell us more?
Yeah, I just hold this, yeah. It's so good for me to sit and listen to everybody, and I'm just sitting here and listening to all the stories. So we've heard about climate change, we've heard about utilisation, we've plants, new spaces. So I kind of start, even just when people were talking, looking around the room, I see flax, Viking, Dublin, and I always remember Melissa in the Botanics, some of your tours telling us, we see flax as brown, but the Vikings would have dyed them up with various colours, reds and yellows and everything. So these would have been very brightly coloured linens in Dublin. They would have been really flashy, they weren't in these boring brown things. So I see linen, and that's our start. Our relationship, we have a lot of plant blindness, we don't see plants sometimes walking in or walking around. We first seen plants as things we could use. So I think that's what that kind of utilisation. Then we became, as Marcus, we were in charge of nature during Victorian times, building glass houses, to try and get all these plants from around the world to grow them, to kind of dominate nature. And I think I remember that glass house when it was like full Victoriana, and I'd say the Victorians would be turning if they see like all the wildness that's going on in there now. And I just think that's amazing. And I think that just the whole process of your work, Melissa, is just amazing there. And then I go to the tree. And the other thing is just that you were saying, just hiding under trees and just being near trees. The NHS are actually prescribing time in nature for people. So, Japanese go out and forest bathe. So if you sit under, we have this innate kind of sense, we want to be near nature. It makes us feel good. If you're in a hospital bed, your recovery has been proven to be faster if you have a plant in your room, something green to look at. So I suppose we don't even, a lovely fact is, that half of us is not human. The other half of us is all this microbes. We have a second brain and a second gut. So why we might, we like being out in nature, but maybe we're feeding our microbiome. We're getting our hands dirty in nature. We're touching things, we might be kind of feeding our second brain. This is doing us good. And I think with nature restoration law, climate change, we're in this new kind of space. You were talking about those pests that are coming. And I suppose, as Marcus said, we've always traded and we've always been moving plants. I suppose I come from a background of horticulture and botany. And I like this new world where we're mixing, the cultivation and the wild. But I suppose with climate change, there's a lot of enemy release. So things can move further than they ever did before. A lot of those pests and diseases are traveling. We don't have the hard winters to kill things off. So we're in this new space for everybody, kind of in this world. And sometimes I worry about that new space because while some of our visitors may be, dandelions are nice, they're benign enough, but something like, the pests and diseases that are coming, that don't die in the winter, I worry about some of them with regards to our flora as well. And then it's nice to just come back around then and the way we manage our landscape has changed. The OPW, all the garden managers, I suppose from horticulture, I would have started in Victoriana, pristine, edging grass, no daisies, putting on chemicals for everything. And now we're in this world where we can see meadows around Dublin, for first time. We see, we're worried about pollinators. pollinators. We have things written into our policies to protect plants and animals in our landscape. And, 30% of our city is meant to be green space now. And that's written into a law, which is wonderful, I think. And I just think the artists, all the artists here, just bring us that bit deeper, that we can actually, they bring us to these stories and see these things. You sitting in the tree, you bring that story to everybody. And I think it's very special that we kind of have that artists kind of help us get a little bit deeper, I think, But I suppose all this diversity, we grow 70,000 different things in horticulture. There's already 1,000 things, that were here from various times and stuff. So I worry, I suppose, I maybe native, non-native, invasive. I suppose I worry that some of our new arrivals might be a bit tuggish, and maybe some of our local stuff is possibly not able to, compete as much, so that we are in this new kind of edgy space. It's like I walked in the lane here and I see all above us, just on the way in, as you walk out, there's a plant from China out there, which is kind of apt because it's Chinese New Year this weekend. So Buddleia davidii is all on the walls. So Dublin is probably basically dominated by this Chinese plant. We don't see it. It's all over our heads, and it does provide a resource for invertebrates and butterflies. I don't mind those things in the city, but I don't kind of want to see them in our mountains so I probably have a bit of a funny, where I accept lots of edginess and mingling versus where I kind of still like to see that bit of, maybe that glimpse of the past, But anyway, thank you.
I'm guessing if anybody has insight, questions, stories.
Part about the invasive species. And I was wondering if you, Marcus, could tell us a little bit about how you see the invasive species issue or non-issue, how you see this.
Oh, it is a very big issue. If there's a particular habitat that is it's on its last legs, it's disappearing very rapidly, well, then an invasive species can be completely detrimental. So we have plants that were introduced into our, like rhododendron or laurel, that were deliberately introduced, and animals too, like the grey squirrel and others that have been deliberately introduced, that can be quite invasive, and in some cases they can be noxious as well. So they can be dangerous to livestock. They can be dangerous to yourself, and so on. So there are laws in many other countries, not so much Ireland, unfortunately, but to restrict some of those plants. But also native species, if we're going to use that, can also be invasive. So the example there is that the Burren, which is a beautiful place to visit, contains plants that are very rarely, hardly ever seen together. Plants from alpine regions and Mediterranean growing in fields where animals are grazing. But if you abandon the land, the hazel grows back. That is common in the area, and so with that hazel infestation, if you want to call it that, you lose your biodiversity that was perhaps not meant to be there in the first place. It just happens to be there because of all the grazing that was going on. So you've created a type of ecology through land management. This is the same with alpine meadows as well that you see in the movies. They're not naturally existing. They are created by grazing and management, and thereby producing great biodiversity and also food for people who eat our milk or whatever they use. So sometimes it can be a problem. Other times, you have to say exactly how much do we have in our resources to be able to deal with it, and so perhaps you pick your battles, and so you pick your battles in the like national parks or places that are examples of ecosystems that are of the past, as that you mentioned. But there are other places that are outside that we just do not have the ability, and cities is a very good example of that. We don't have the ability to manage for something in the past, and perhaps we should be actually thinking, instead of restoring to something of the past or an idyllic past, that we should be thinking of restoring towards the future. That we should be looking at what those plants are telling us about that location. That by growing there, invasive or not, they're saying that they're the thugs, as you would say, but they're also hardy enough to be able to withstand all of the pressures that climate change forcing and human is throwing at it. And so they're not necessarily devoid of biodiversity. They may not have the same type of biodiversity as other systems. But what I would argue is that there is a place for everything in this. So we could put our energies into something removing existing. And islands are a good example where we can remove things and they never come back. We can remove the rats off an island and then the ecology will come back, the birds or whatever. But in larger states, if you can, and I worked with conservation volunteers for a long time with bringing volunteers to do conservation restoring work. And I've gone back to those places 20 years later, and I know the amount of labor that went into removing something, and it's all back. So what do you do in that situation? You don't want to tell people. You want to say, okay, let's just see what our relationship with these plants really is, and what we can use it for in a forward thinking. Are we able to look at plants as showing us what resilience really is in the face of change? And so perhaps there's a more hopeful message about plants. So the invasive is in the eye of the beholder, I think, because there's a legal requirement in national parks and nature reserves to remove invasive species or in non-indigenous species that might threaten the flora and fauna. But if they're not really threatening, if they just happen to be in there occasionally, so if you go out to any coastal area, you'll see valerian, for example, growing in the sand dunes. You'll see sweet pea, garden escapes sweet pea growing in the sand dunes. Is it causing a problem? We don't really particularly know, but it does provide a lot of nectar in a place which is often devoid of nectar because it's mostly grasses growing along there. So it's situationally dependent, and so it's not, we can't paint a broad brushstroke with everything. But that's what my argument would be, that perhaps we could let's this is an awful phrase, have that conversation. But if you know what I mean, that's that idea that it's having a legal requirement is perfectly correct, and having the European decade of restoration to restore ecosystems is perfectly correct. And Ireland, the new restoration law that we have to sign up to, that 30% of our island will be restored to nature, that's perfectly correct. But there's other spaces, and these are spaces that have co-benefits that are beyond just the nature. They're benefits in terms of what people, like we were just hearing, the people who they see things that's in their eye and in their brain and their mind and in their heart that actually creates a different reality of that location that I think actually is something that's not written into the restoration books. I hope that answers it.
Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Yes, you have.
You were talking about the difference and you're like going through the experience of Melissa's work. What is the level of biodiversity that we can find and is like connecting with these new ecosystems, and what is your take about it?
Well, I suppose it's how we measure biodiversity. So if we count the number of species we grow, by having lots of new things arrive, well, then our numbers increase. So I suppose it's how we measure it, how we count it, and what, and even like putting a value on things, So I suppose we have about 1,000 things that we kind of consider have been here already, but we can grow 70,000 things, which is massive. So while, when we talk about invasives and new species and stuff like that, I suppose things like Japanese knotweed, which is quite tuggish, won an award for being a fabulous garden plant in the 1850s. So sometimes we don't, we might see one sweet pea on a sand dune, but we don't know where that sweet pea in 100 years' time with climate change. So I suppose I'd be a little bit more, I go back to my horticultural roots. I'm a bit like, a weed being a plant in the wrong place if I'm out in the wild. I love exotica in cities. I don't mind seeing, all that sort of stuff. But if I'm out in a sand dune, I don't really want to be looking at a garden plant. So I suppose, measuring and monitoring biodiversity, I think, will be a big issue for us going forward. And there are these very interesting new spaces. I love walking down by the docks as well, because there's always lots of our wacky new things appear at docks. In the old days, things used to come in off ships that maybe weren't covered, and all the botanists would flog near the docks because you get to see lots of new things, you know, that sort of way. So now the new things are kind of all around us, and yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how all the new things get along together. I kind of think they're like, you know, maybe like little kids in a school, you know. It's like, you know, there's ones that have maybe established their territory, and there's new ones popping in, and it's shaking it all up, I think. And yeah, I think we live in a very interesting time, definitely in urban areas. I mean, half of people live in urban areas. You know, we need to be, you know, so many meters from green space. This has been kind of shoved out. So I think in Belgium, half the native plants live in a city, you know, half the native birds live in a city. So while half of us live in a city, half of the biodiversity lives alongside us. You know, there is stuff that doesn't live in cities, but, you know, to have half the plants and half the birds of a country, and to have 40% of all the insects living with you, you know, we don't often think that they're all here with us, but they are, you know. Yeah.
That's fantastic. So I'm conscious of the time that we promised to be, and I would like to give you time for maybe more questions, or actually see the exhibition and maybe have a more less threatening questions to the artist and our guest. I would like to thank you very much for coming and have us here. Of course, please do.
Like, do you think that there is potential going forward for a more transdisciplinary approach to ecology with critical ecologies that includes science, botany, ecology, more artistic endeavours, a kind of a more feminizing or a decolonial, and all of those things? Do you see that happening within institutions or at policy levels in the future?
Yeah, I certainly do. But I've been kind of in this particular area for a lot longer, and for a lot of my academic career, I was a bit of an outlier. You know, not really successful at getting jobs in that, because I would have a different viewpoint that from other more traditional disciplines. But that has very much changed. I'll give you an example. I have one of my PhD students, Natalia, is from Bogota, Colombia, and she is researching with communities like groups like this, where they collect plants and then she gets them to create herbaria, specimens, not by flattening them and putting them between paper, but painting them. But she's able to look at their relationships with nature and listen to them talking about them, and then be able to discern how their relationships with wild spaces are. That is something that would not have been, well, I don't know how, she's brilliant, by the way, but she has us all to shame, but that would not be something that would be the normal in many places. But it's becoming more and more common now to see multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and when we say transdisciplinary, we work with citizens. So the Novel Eco project, for example, is a citizen science project. So we have an app that people can use to try to identify plants and find out what that means to them. And we're not the only one. There's quite a lot of organizations looking to work with citizens and communities and indigenous communities. There's a huge gendered aspect of this that has very rarely not really been looked at a lot. And we talk a lot about multi-species justice and other things that are just starting to come out, and we require transdisciplinary research to do that. So it's actually brilliant to see that the next couple of decades is going to be very, very exciting, because scientists are more open to other values now than they would have been, because you wouldn't have got published if you started talking about how you felt about something. But now you can say that people perceive it something in such a way that actually means something from a policy point of view. So
That's
good. Thanks for asking.
Very interesting, following the debate on whether the Anthropocene exists and stuff like that, and then seeing it move between, you know, philosophers and people more into the thought side of it, and scientists, and then the influence of obviously the people who fund geologists, like the oil companies and everything, all coming into it. It seems like it's at an exciting time where there are generative, critical discussions happening.
Yeah, and we're currently, there's other people using AI now to look at how, if you can scan and go through the media, how on social media, how people talk about their plants, their animals, and it started really during COVID when people were emailing and texting or going through Twitter to various schools to send a photograph saying, what is this? I saw it in my garden, I saw it at the side. We were inundated with hundreds of them. I know you were in UCD as well. There's hundreds of them were sent in. We were sending them around our students saying, can you identify this for this weed? And we are now able to use AI to look at how people perceive them in a negative or positive way, which is something we could never have done. But we can do this now on a global scale as opposed to just a local scale. That's very, very interesting work. So, sorry.
Just to say, like, our perception, what we're, we're accepting of this newer age. Like, I would have started in Victoriana horticulture, and now it's so wonderful to see how we're accepting, my neighbours not mowing their lawns, everybody is out looking for bee, you know what I mean? Like pollinator friendly planting, like this kind of joy is coming back to people, and I think that's a very good thing. School gardens, I think this. I suppose we were a very rural country in a sense, and then losing our connection to nature when everybody went off to the cities to get jobs. So I think we have this new space with new people coming up, and technology is really, really helping. And I think COVID, for all its sins, it slowed everybody down, got stuck in the 1K looking, orchids were found in housing estates, like, because the grass wasn't grown, been cut, and, people were out seeing things, like, which, busy city life, we don't. So our plant blindness, we walk around every day, we don't see plants, we see the bus stop, or we see the street or the light, we don't see the little plant in the pavement, or we don't see things, like that. And I suppose, so I think, it's good,
How do you feel about the new invasive species AI trawling the internet to see how we feel about existing species?
That's probably a conversation for a few pints. I'll be honest, because you're right. Actually, just in terms of invasive, something is invasive. Scientifically, there's a definition of what that means, but also we all have our own perception of what that means, and actually it means more to us in some cases because it's such a very strong word. It's quite an evocative word because it describes more than just an activity of a passively growing plant doing its own thing. It has a sort of an aggressive and perhaps warlike, or bellicose is the word, if I remember my Latin from that has that sort of tinge to it, and that certainly now spreads out across, as you were saying, in terms of AI and other things. I don't know enough about AI. I have a postdoc who's doing AI for me, and I smile politely when we're talking, but I'm really I'm not understanding much of what he's telling me. But perhaps sometimes my own personal belief always has been that we discount things at our peril. That perhaps the best way to understand something, to test it, put it to the test. Let's see exactly what it means. What these species are doing. Let's ask what they are. And we can find values that didn't emerge. I would never have known, like what you were just talking about, especially with the camera work. I would never have been, thought to that. But now we're surrounded by potential areas that people can engage with nature using either old types of technologies or very new types of technologies. I think we need to not necessarily embrace them wholeheartedly, but allow them to have a space. Because the minute we say no to something, we lose a potential area. I'd like to keep all our options open. So sorry, that's just my own personal thing.
It sort of takes it out of the binary as well, like invasive species or the non-natives or anything like that. We shouldn't be seeing them within this binary of whether they're good or bad. There's a lot more to it than that, really.
Yeah, I agree.
Then thank you very much again to be here to share with us. Thank you very much for coming, and you can, of course, see the exhibitions. We're going to stay for a few minutes more in case there are more questions, and in case you have to go, the gallery is open tomorrow and Sunday as well until 6, from 12 to 6. Thank you.